Hey guys, welcome back. So this month's book review is a very famous writing book that doesn't need any introduction. It's Stephen King's On Writing. And the whole point of this series is that every month I want to go through a known writing advice book and basically pick out 3 tools, techniques or processes that I really like, that are very applicable, and just highlight them quickly, basically acting as an inspiration or as a reminder of all the tools and techniques and stuff that is in those books that we could use and integrate into our writing process, or reintegrate it if you already had it and maybe forgot about it over time. And it's also about really collecting an ever-growing library of these tools and techniques and approaches, and really just having basically all of them at our disposal to then start to use them whenever we want to, or also start putting together our own writing process. So Stephen King's On Writing is really the writing advice book that I think most of us got started on. It's the book that gets recommended to you first whenever you are interested in starting writing, and it's really just a book that you can read it and enjoy reading it without being interested in writing, because the first part of the book is really just the biography and his life story and basically where his passion for writing came from, and then the second part is a much more in-depth process of how he writes his books. I really enjoy how he goes in-depth into his writing process and basically lays out the entire process and also gives his opinions on certain things very clearly. The thing with that is though that over time a lot of the advice, or even just kind of like what he does, has been taken and turned into rules. So a lot of the stuff that you read in his process you find on blogs or websites or in YouTube videos where people cite it as a sort of rule. And that is something that I very clearly want to state. This is his process, right? And the fascinating thing about it is seeing a famous writer's process so clearly spelled out. But because it is so clearly put into steps, it is also very easy to think that you have to fall into his writing process, which of course doesn't work for everyone. So another thing about his writing process is that it's a very discovery writing approach, at least the way he spelled it out in this book. He talks about how he has plotted some books, but one part of the book even mentions how he doesn't believe that plot is even a thing. So statements like that might be very confusing when you are someone who likes to plot a lot, or it's the advice that he gives in conjunction with his belief that plot doesn't exist won't work for you if you have a completely different approach, right? That being said, let's get into the 3 tools that I took away from this book, that I remember the best from this book and that I really like. So the first thing isn't exactly a technique, it's more tying into this whole advice of write what you know and basically giving a very clear example of what that could look like. So he goes into the example of how in John Grisham's book, The Firm, basically there's a very detailed explanation of how the lawyer, the protagonist in that story, how his work routine looks. He's the kind of person who's very ambitious and very much wants to outdo all his new colleagues. So someone who gets up, I think it was like at 4 a.m. and then works like 16-hour days. And it's really just a very detailed description of that daily routine and of this whole mindset of clocking as many hours as possible and stuff like that, right? And the thing that Stephen King mentions here is that a lot of the interesting parts of reading that book come from having this very clear routine, this very clear specific life of someone that you yourself aren't, and that you yourself, you have never lived that kind of life, right? But you get all the details and you get the entire routine and all, and that's a very satisfying thing for a reader because it immerses them completely into the reality of the story. And basically that John Grisham was a lawyer. He probably took all the details of his young lawyer life and mixed them into the story, so that basically the daily routine and the aspects of the job that he had from experience, that he can go into detail, make the world seem more realistic, and because of that the plot and the story itself, which is rather unrealistic, feels more realistic. So he goes into this whole example of this story, and the reason why I remember this example so well is because when I read this book, I also had read The Firm, and all the things that he basically pointed out about how what was interesting to read the specificity of that life is exactly what I remember from The Firm. I didn't necessarily like the mystery aspect that much in that book, but I did very much find the whole lifestyle of the protagonist and how he goes about that stuff very fascinating. And I remember those details very clearly. And here in Stephen King's writing advice, it's very interesting how he goes into this whole example of write what you know, what that could look like, and basically how to do it. Then the second thing is more in terms of process. So Stephen King's writing process, usually in that time at least, would be, it would roughly take him 3 months to write the novel, and then he would put away that manuscript for up to 6 months and basically forget about the story enough so that by the time that he comes back for the editing, he's almost like a fresh reader and experiencing the story for the first time in a different way, so that he can do the edits better, right? And that is a very applicable technique that I feel makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it depends a bit on your own writing process, but just from my complete amateur perspective, I think it makes really a lot of sense to have the time to put away a story once you have written it before coming back to it for the edit. So I don't really like this whole idea of having to rush the editing process so much that you have to write the story and then immediately edit and publish, you know. I like the whole thing of giving yourself the time to forget enough about the details and stuff that you can experience the story for the first time so that you have fresh eyes to actually edit it, and also to just actually give yourself the chance to even experience your story in that way, which you wouldn't if you immediately edit and publish, right? Again, obviously not applicable in all kinds of situations, but as a starting point, I think it's something that makes a lot of sense and at least is worth trying out once or twice. And then the third thing is a very applicable technique that I remember the best, even though I read this book 10 years ago for the first time, and it is something that has stuck with me always, and that is his approach to starting stories. So in that time, he would basically start with what if scenario stories. So basically what he would have is, he has like, what if an entire town gets locked in by some sort of invisible force? What if there is a mist going through a small town and there are alien creatures in it and everybody gets locked in a supermarket? What if there is a woman and a child locked into their cars and they are attacked by a rabid dog? You know, you get it. It's kind of like those what if scenarios that already have the conflict as well as some character sketch in the idea itself. And basically what he would do, he has like this what if scenario, and because he has the conflict and the characters and this situation to start with, he could just go from there, start writing, and that's basically his discovery writing approach of just writing the story and seeing how these characters get themselves out of that situation. So that is a starting point that I think makes a lot of sense if you are looking to just write a new story but you don't necessarily have an idea, or if you are someone who doesn't like to plan out or plot out your story, then those kinds of conflict situations that are the starting point where the characters are in a situation that they have to get themselves out of is a pretty easy way to get started without having to do any planning, because it's really just about how does the character get out of this situation. So yeah, those are the 3 things out of this book that I consider very applicable and that I want to highlight. And if you are interested in the entire series, you can go here, which has last month's review, and I will add to it whenever I do a monthly review. And other than that, I will see you next time. Bye guys.